What are you waiting for, David?
He thought it was just another night serving tables, polite smiles, quiet steps, blending into the background. But then, laughter echoed through the room. A Chinese billionaire, dressed in power and arrogance, pointed at him and mocked his very existence. The crowd joined in, their laughter sharp and cruel. For a moment, the black waiter stood frozen, humiliated in front of everyone. But what came next, no one expected, because when he opened his mouth, the entire room went silent. The banquet hall glowed like a palace, every corner polished to perfection. Golden chandeliers hung above long tables draped in silk, their surfaces crowded with silverware that shimmered under the lights. It wasn't just a dinner, it was a display of power, a gathering of the elite who believed the world belonged to them. Every laugh rang with entitlement, every handshake sealed another fortune. At the center of it all sat a Chinese billionaire, celebrated as a financial genius, his presence commanding attention. Cameras followed his movements, reporters scribbled down every word, and other wealthy guests leaned in close, eager to bask in his shadow. He was used to being admired, used to people lowering their heads in his presence. And then there was David. Tall, reserved, and dressed in the crisp uniform of the waitstaff, he slipped between the tables with practiced ease. A tray balanced on one hand, he offered glasses of champagne and delicate hors d'oeuvres with quiet professionalism. To most, he was invisible, a background figure in someone else's story. But behind his steady eyes, there was more. David wasn't just a waiter. He was a man with dreams larger than this room, a man who had studied hard, who carried knowledge and discipline in silence. Fluent in multiple languages, sharp in observation, he had taken the job not out of lack of ambition, but out of necessity. And yet, tonight, none of that mattered. His skin color defined him in their eyes before he ever opened his mouth. The subtle glances started first, quick, dismissive looks from guests who saw him as less. Then came the whispers, exchanged over wine glasses, whispers that didn't stay quiet for long, because before the night was over, mockery would break the air. And David, the man they thought invisible, would reveal just how wrong they were. The first crack in the evening's polish came in the form of laughter. It wasn't the polite kind, the type shared among old friends, but sharp, cutting, designed to wound. The sound rolled across the hall like a wave, drawing eyes toward the head table where the billionaire reclined with an arrogance only immense wealth could fuel. His jeweled cufflinks sparkled as he gestured broadly, his words carrying just far enough to be heard by more than the people seated near him. David had been walking past at that moment, a tray balanced carefully in his hand, when the billionaire's gaze locked onto him. The room seemed to quiet for just a second, the way a stage stills before a performance begins.
Look at this.
Then the billionaire smirked, his voice loud enough for half the hall to hear. A servant in his own country, yet he dreams of standing among us. What a joke. Laughter erupted from the table. The kind of laughter that doesn't come from humor but from cruelty, shared among those who think themselves untouchable. David's chest tightened, though his expression remained calm. He lowered the tray to offer drinks, his professionalism unbroken, though inside every mocking sound felt like a weight pressing down on him. But the billionaire wasn't finished. He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing with the pleasure of an audience. Tell me, do you even understand us? Or do you only know how to smile and nod? Perhaps you should fetch another tray before you spill this one. More laughter. It spread now to other tables, guests craning their necks to see what the commotion was about. The orchestra faltered for a moment, the music dipping before recovering. It was as if the entire room had been pulled into the spectacle of one man's humiliation. David felt the sting, but he stood steady. He had known ridicule before. He had endured worse in silence. Yet something about tonight felt different. The blatant nature of it, the way wealth and power gave this man permission to mock him openly, as if his dignity, were an acceptable sacrifice for entertainment. It struck a nerve deep within him. He glanced around the hall. Some guests shifted uncomfortably, their eyes lowering as though silence absolved them of complicity. Others chuckled, eager to align themselves with power. And then there were those who watched with curiosity, leaning forward as though waiting to see what he would do. The billionaire's voice cut through again, this time sharper. "Come now, say something. Do you speak at all, or are you just here to bow your head and take orders?" David's hand tightened slightly on the tray. His heart thudded in his chest, each beat echoing louder than the last. He could feel the expectation pressing in, the weight of dozens of eyes studying him, as though he were not a man, but a spectacle. The humiliation was complete. He had been reduced to an object, a target of ridicule. But beneath the humiliation stirred something else. A quiet flame that had burned for years, fed by every look, every whisper, every reminder that he was seen as less. Tonight, in this room filled with power and pride, that flame began to rise. Still, he did not speak. Not yet. Instead, he moved with the same quiet precision, setting glasses on the table, his face betraying nothing of the storm inside. His silence made the billionaire laugh even louder, interpreting it as weakness. "See?" He cannot answer. Perhaps he doesn't understand us at all. What use is a man who cannot even speak the language of those above him? The words stung, not just for their cruelty, but for their confidence. The billionaire spoke as though his truth were undeniable, as though he had already won. And the room, drunk on wealth and laughter, seemed to agree. David straightened slowly, lifting his head. His eyes met the billionaire's for the first time, not with fear, but with a calm, steady defiance. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it carried weight. For the first time, the billionaire's smirk faltered ever so slightly. The room leaned in. Something had shifted. Because David wasn't about to remain silent forever, and what he was about to say would not only end the laughter, it would leave every single person in that hall frozen in disbelief. The laughter had reached its peak, echoing across the grand hall like a cruel chorus. Glasses clinked, heads turned, and even those who hadn't heard the beginning leaned in to enjoy the end. For a moment, David felt the weight of it all pressing down on his shoulders. Every smirk, every insult, every dismissive glance. They saw him as powerless, voiceless, a man defined only by the uniform he wore and the color of his skin. But then, something shifted. David placed his tray down gently on the edge of the table. The clinking of glass stopped. His hands, steady and precise, no longer carried the burden of service. He straightened to his full height, taller than many had noticed before. His eyes, calm yet piercing, locked onto the billionaire who had mocked him so openly. The room quieted, if only for curiosity. People leaned forward, some with smirks, others with raised brows. They expected perhaps a stammer, a broken protest, or silence once again. What they did not expect was what came next. When David spoke, his words were not in English. They flowed in flawless Mandarin Chinese, his voice measured, deep, and commanding. "You laugh at me because you cannot see real strength." His eyes widened, his hand tightening around the stem of his wineglass. The words rolled out with such clarity and authority that for a heartbeat, it seemed impossible that they had come from the man he had just ridiculed. Gasps rippled through the room. A few guests choked on their drinks. Others whispered in disbelief, their heads turning as though searching for confirmation that what they had heard was real. But David was not finished. His voice grew stronger, each word slicing through the silence like a blade. True dignity cannot be bought with wealth. True respect cannot be earned by mocking others. The room froze. The orchestra's instruments, mid-melody, faltered into silence. Every eye was locked on him now, not as a waiter, not as a shadow in the room, but as a man who had turned humiliation into power. The billionaire's face flushed red, caught between anger and embarrassment. For the first time in perhaps years, he was not in control of the room. The authority he had wielded so casually slipped from his grasp in an instant. David's words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. He did not raise his voice, did not need to. The calm in his tone carried more power than any shout could. He had chosen his moment, and with a few sentences, he had stripped away the facade of superiority that had shielded the billionaire. Around the room, the silence deepened. Guests who had laughed moments before now lowered their eyes, shame prickling at the edges of their conscience. Some looked at David with newfound respect, while others with discomfort, confronted with the truth he had spoken so plainly. The billionaire shifted in his seat, searching for words, but none came. How could he respond? The man he had mocked as beneath him had just revealed a depth of intelligence and strength that no amount of money could overshadow. His arrogance, once a weapon, now looked like weakness. And David? He simply stood there, composed, unwavering. He had no need to shout, no need to gloat. His silence after the words was louder than anything the billionaire could muster. In that moment, the power in the room shifted. The billionaire was no longer the center of gravity. All eyes, all attention, belonged to the man they had dismissed. The waiter who had spoken in flawless Chinese, who had reminded them all that dignity is not defined by wealth or status. And as the billionaire sat in stunned silence, the hall felt something it hadn't expected that night. Humility. The laughter was gone. All that remained was silence. Heavy, uncomfortable, undeniable. For a long moment, the room held its breath. The chandelier lights still glimmered, the wine still sat untouched in crystal glasses, but the atmosphere had shifted entirely. The billionaire, once the loudest voice in the hall, sat frozen, his confidence shattered by the weight of words he never expected to hear. The smirk that had seemed permanent was gone, replaced by the uneasy stiffness of a man stripped bare in front of his peers. David stood silently, his presence commanding without effort. He didn't need to add more. The strength of his response was not in volume, but in the simplicity of truth. He had no fortune to flaunt, no cameras to chase him, no crowd begging for his attention, yet in that instant he held more authority than anyone else in the hall. A few guests shifted in their chairs, discomfort etched on their faces. Some avoided his gaze entirely, ashamed that they had joined in the laughter. Others stared at him with a mix of awe and respect, realizing they had just witnessed something extraordinary, a man reclaiming his dignity in the face of overwhelming power. The billionaire tried once, twice, to form words, but none came. His silence was its own confession. The arrogance that had filled the hall minutes earlier now looked small, petty, and powerless. David quietly picked up his tray again. With calm composure, he moved back into the rhythm of his work, as though nothing had happened. But everyone knew that everything had changed. He was no longer invisible. He was unforgettable. Long after the night ended, whispers of the moment traveled beyond the golden walls of the banquet. People spoke of the waiter who silenced a billionaire, the man who reminded a room full of power that respect is not purchased with money, and dignity is not granted by status. And as the story spread, so did the question. How many more times must it take? How many humiliations endured? How many voices silenced? Before the world finally learns that respect is not a privilege, but a right?